Clear prop.
Star 73, Cherokee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and its co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
I'm great. Another week, another show. This one, we've talked about it a couple of times, but I'll ask you a question that you've answered before. What's the 3 most important things you should be thinking about as an aviator when you're in flight?
Well, there's 3 things, and there's actually sometimes we can say there's 5 things, but the first of number 1 is fuel. And number 2 is fuel. And number 3 is fuel. And if we go the 5 version of this, number 4 is fuel.
There you go.
And number 5 is fuel.
We need fuel. And this week, all we're going to talk about is fuel systems. And again, talking about GA aircraft and what we train in and what we normally take flight tests or examinations in are Warriors and Cessnas and Archers and those sorts of things. So we're gonna stay focused primarily on the Piper low wing fuel system and the Cessna high wing fuel system and how they work in these GA aircraft. Man, I think if I was really honest, again, early on in my private days and probably up to my private check ride, I knew there was a left, right, both switch and an off. I knew there was a lever to turn the fuel system off, and I knew there was a fuel vent, but I don't think I really knew what the fuel vent did.
Right.
And I flew strictly Cessnas from start to check ride day. And I look back and now as I own the flight school and I see private pilots and solo students walking around, I'm sitting here anxiously thinking, well, how well do they know the fuel system? I hope they know it better than I did when I took the plane.
Yeah.
It's a pretty important system, as you highlight and we joke about. It's a really, really important system.
Yeah, I don't know where I saw the statistic. I know it was at a safety seminar in Houston many, many years ago, but there was a slide that was put up, and it said that 47% of the general aviation accidents in the Houston region had a fuel element to them.
Wow.
Whether it be fuel starvation or fuel exhaustion, and they're different because in a Piper airplane or a Beechcraft airplane where we have to switch the tanks, we could make that engine quit due to fuel starvation and still have fuel in the other tank. Mm-hmm. That's just really tragic if an airplane crashes due to fuel starvation, but there's still plenty of fuel that we just didn't access.
Yeah, and as I sit here and think about it, a number of the incidents that I've heard over the last decade around here at Hobby, a twin landed on 59 because of fuel contamination.
Right.
Another topic that wasn't in your short list there that really can cause problems in an aircraft. I think they got jet fuel in their twin, and it contaminated the fuel, and it ran for a while, but then obviously didn't. And it can't run on the wrong fuel, right? So very, very important subject. And I think we talked, I guess it was last week, about the books for check rides. The POH will tell you how the fuel system works. I think you really should understand how the fuel system does work for sure.
Right. And, one thing that I will bring up sometimes on check rides is if we're talking about the fuel system, we're required to cover 3 systems on a check ride. So fuel system is one that occasionally, or I don't know what the percentages are, but sometimes we get into that, and that's one of the systems that I pick for a check ride. I think more so on Cessnas, most of the Cessna pilots think, well, you just leave it on both and that's it. That's all we need to do with it. Are there ever occasions where we would put that fuel selector on left or on right in the air? And there could be. You could have a fuel leak and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of how we would manage a fuel leak, but there could be a situation where you wanted to just burn the fuel from one given tank in a Cessna, rather than just leaving it on both. Now, obviously, the system is a little bit simpler, because in a perfect world, I think most of the Cessnas have you actually put it on left or right when you shut down, and that's just to basically exercise the fuel valve and make sure all the seals and everything stay lubricated a little bit. But there are some other things to think about on a Cessna. That fuel vent is usually over on the left tank. Which causes pressure differential in the two fuel tanks. And typically, when you fill up a Cessna, the left tank will usually take a little bit more fuel than the right tank, and that's normal. I mean, it's not going to be noticeably, but if you may put 10 gallons in the left tank and 9.2 in the right tank, something like that.
We've had that squawked many times, that there's a problem with the fuel system because they're going at different rates, when in fact it's just as simple as that, or maybe the fuel vents got moved a little bit and the pressure's immensely stronger than expected, and the fuel drains quite a bit differently. I think from a learning perspective, for me, again, learning these systems early on, I remembered I couldn't fly these fancy S models. They were more expensive and nicer, and they were fuel injected. And I knew they were fuel injected, and I didn't want to spend the money, and I didn't train in those. And then, so I stayed in these other planes that were carbureted, and they were cheaper, and so I liked it more. But I thought the S models had a fuel pump, and that the NNP models didn't have a fuel pump. I've gotten smarter, and I know that all planes have a fuel pump, but maybe we could talk a little bit. Still high wings here, Cessna Fuel Systems. What's the difference in a Cessna that has an electronic fuel pump and a Cessna that doesn't have an electronic fuel pump? Well,
we can go back and we can look at the engine. Most of these airplanes have Lycoming engines, and they're usually O320s or O360s, and that O has a meaning, and what it means is opposed. It means that the cylinders are horizontally opposed, and this isn't about that. But sometimes you'll fly an airplane that has an IO360, and the I stands for injected, means fuel injected. You may fly an airplane that has a TIO, maybe a TIO 540. And that T stands for turbocharged. So the designation of the engine tells you something right there. So if you're flying an airplane that's an IO 320 or an IO 360, for instance, it's fuel injected. So it's not going to have a carburetor. So a couple things that you're going to know right off the bat. There's not going to be any carburetor heat. So it does simplify something right there. And this can go back to the reason we use checklists. Maybe we're in a carbureted airplane today and we're not really used to flying it, so we're not used to using the carburetor heat. But guess what? It's going to be on the landing checklist. So just use the checklist and follow the prescribed procedure from the manufacturer. But an IO 360 or 320, doesn't really matter, is a fuel-injected engine, and it will have an electric fuel pump in addition to the engine-driven fuel pump. The engine-driven fuel pump is something that we don't really have control over. If it fails, there's nothing we can do about it. And in fact, we may not even know that it failed. So there's nothing we can really do about it. But an IO airplane will have a fuel pump, and that is basically how we prime the airplane, how we get the fuel to get the airplane started.
Yeah, and I think in the Piper, we'll get to them maybe, but we use that in different critical phases where we're maybe changing the fuel system because the gravity's not driving some of that as well. But I think I now looking back feel pretty stupid that I didn't even think my plane had a fuel pump, but it does. It's engine driven and it's mechanical in nature, not electronic in nature. Other highlights about a Cessna fuel system, I guess the shutoff valve is obviously a pretty important one. You would need to check and obviously follow checklists again, and you'll be fine with that one. We talked about the switch going from off, left, both, right. What do you feel about moving that switch during flight, Wally? How do you like to move that switch during flight?
Well, again,
we'll talk about both systems here. I guess this is a pretty critical lever.
Right. In a Cessna, it's going to stay on both, and you're not really going to move it unless you're in some sort of an abnormal situation. However, in a Piper, you are going to move from tank to tank. When I was taught, it was a big deal. It was a big deal to move that fuel valve, to go from one tank to the other. And, you're going to do what the POH prescribes. In most airplanes, it will have you turn the fuel pump on and then move the valve from one side to the other. And then my eyes are always on the fuel pressure gauge, making sure that fuel pressure gauge doesn't go anywhere. And then I will turn the fuel pump off. I actually flew a friend's Bonanza probably about a year ago, and when I switched the fuel from one tank to the other, I got a bump in the fuel pressure, and I just went right back to the other and just left it there and landed that way. And then when I landed, I called him and I mentioned it to him. He said, "Oh yeah, that's pretty normal. It should be fine." But it sure got my attention. The other thing I do, and this is probably over the top, and this may be considered paranoid, but before I switch the fuel from one tank to another, I'm looking for an airport, a hard surface airport to land at, and just in case that I shut it off. Of course, if I flip the valve and the engine shuts down, I'm going to go right back to the other side, and hopefully the engine's going to start right back up. And then I'm going to get the airplane on the ground. But what I see on check rides is most of the flight schools have some sort of a timer set up on their. Again, the standard around here is Garmin 430s or 530s in these airplanes, and you can set timers. And most of the schools have 30-minute timers, so every 30 minutes we're flipping the valve from one side to the other. And I see a lot of people are pretty casual about moving that valve. And again, I've never had an engine quit from moving that valve, but they are pretty casual. And I would say just pick your time. I mean, that when that message comes up that says switch tanks, it's really a suggestion. It's not a mandate. 600 feet on final approach when we're coming into land probably isn't a good time to switch the valve.
Do you think? Do you think that unfortunately we've taught our students in general where we become robotic to the buzzer, that like the beep beep beep, now we got to change it?
Yeah, I think we have. I think
and we lose some of that professionalism of like, does this make sense? Am I using all my good decision making processes to do the right thing?
Yeah, and what I do in my airplane, I have a Saratoga, which is a low wing Piper, holds a lot of fuel, 102 gallons, and what I do is I run it. If I'm going on a long cross-country flight, I run it 1 hour on one side, and then I switch to the other side, and I stay on the other side for 2 hours, and then go back to the original side for the last hour. And quite honestly, I don't know if I've ever made that second switch, because I don't think I've ever flown my airplane longer than 3 hours. My bladder doesn't last that long, so I'm usually stopping. Now, if there's a flight, a distance that's 4 hour and 5 minute flight, would I might, but I think I would just leave it on that other tank and just come in and land, just to minimize the number of times that I'm switching the valves. Now, the other side of that is, well, geez, I'm in a Cessna. I'm just going to leave it on both, and I'm never gonna move the valve. Well, that's not good either. You need to exercise the valve and make sure everything stays lubricated and so forth in there. So and that's just out of the POH. Most of these airplanes has you switch it to one side when you shut down.
And it probably could be completely urban legend, but when I was a student, I had heard that we did some of that in case we got the wrong gas pumped in. They caught it. They'd only contaminate one tank, not both tanks, and that might save somebody some money if we only had to clean one tank out. Yeah. Or if we put water or bad gas or whatever else, we're causing half the damage instead of the whole damage. But I like the cycling it to keep it in working order, because we've all seen things break, man. I can't imagine what my heart would do if I reached down and turned that and it popped out.
Yeah.
And I couldn't turn it.
Yeah.
And it maybe got stuck to the off position or in between positions, and who knows what's going on with the fuel system at that point.
Yeah.
So a Piper, I fly more Cessnas than I do Pipers, but the Twins, a low wing plane, has 4 tanks. We use auxiliary tanks. We're doing a lot with that fuel system as well. And different times, different stages of flight, you're using main versus auxiliary tanks. And you maybe change that more in the Twin. But let's talk through the lower wing aircraft. We've got 2 tanks, right and left. We have an electric fuel pump that helps the non-gravity system get it to the electric or the engine-driven fuel pump. Let's talk through a little bit about what we're thinking there on that system, Wally, as it relates to how do we prime the engine. Same sort of stuff there, right?
Yeah, and even in a Piper, if it's a fuel-injected airplane, you will have a primer. Again, fuel-injected airplane, you're not going to have a primer, so it's primed using the fuel pump essentially. And I say not having a primer, it essentially does. The fuel pump is the primer, but not the little piston little thing that we pump in just an E024, say.
So even a carbureted Piper, Warrior Archer, may have a primer, and it has an electric fuel pump, but it's just not fuel injected.
Right.
So I would use that fuel pump in different stages of flight, whereas in a Cessna that's fuel injected that has an electronic fuel pump, if I were to switch tanks, I don't turn that fuel pump on. I don't need that boost pump to be on while I throw that lever. But it's pretty important in a low-wing plane that we engage. Again, follow the checklist, but 99 out of 100 of them say engage that boost pump or that fuel pump while you're switching that tank. What is that doing for the system or for the aircraft while they're switching tanks?
Just giving a little extra boost to the fuel pressure, just in case there's, I don't know, maybe there's a little air on the line or so. It should help you with that.
I've always thought of it as like a backup for whatever's going on. Since this is so freaking critical that we're going to flip this switch, we better get the fuel moving as best we can, no matter what.
Right.
Because even if there was some hesitation, we'd want some pressure to be in that line to be getting that fuel to the cylinder so that we get an explosion, of course.
Right.
And I think for me, as I fly more Cessnas with the 1A2 versus the Pipers, I normally think of the 30 minutes or whatever system I'm on from switching tanks, but it's those other critical phases. On takeoff, you normally have the fuel pump on, and on landing, I think most planes will say have the fuel pump on in the Warrior and Archer flavors. But again, it's more about critical phases of flight where you want to make sure you've got as much redundancy as you can, because if that engine-driven fuel pump, for whatever reason, failed and we didn't know it, we definitely wouldn't want there to be some hesitation at 100 feet on the go, and that electronic fuel pump would provide us a little bit more, I'll say it, backup for that critical phase of flight.
Right. And something else to think about is if we're just like when you pull the mixture on the airplane, it takes just a few seconds for that fuel to stop and the engine to quit. When we're switching tanks, if we were to take the fuel selector and go to off, the engine's going to run for a little while. one thing I would be, and this is a technique, I think it's a good technique, but if you're taking the runway and you realize that your fuel selector is not on the tank that you want it to be on, right before the takeoff roll is probably not a good time to make that switch, because you could push the power up and get the power, and just about the time you lift off is when the fuel actually all goes away, and that means the engine goes away. Of course, that may not be a horrible place to lose an engine just as you lift off, because you probably have plenty of runway ahead of you, usually. But anyway, just be careful and make sure, just make sure that it makes sense to switch the tank. When you're thinking that you should do it. In other words, going back to the 600 feet on final approach, probably not the most ideal time to switch to move that fuel valve.
Yeah, I like the thought of just make good decisions. Like, that's not a good decision. So if I'm going to make the decision to move this, don't be doing it just because a buzzer went off. A buzzer might have gone off to say, hey, you might want to start thinking about, is this the right time to switch the tank, and go through that decision process to make it. So we talk a lot about it around here. Fuel gauges. They're a very important tool. Nobody should trust the fuel gauge necessarily. We want to visually inspect and go look at those tanks and sump our tanks as well. Let's talk about a little bit about the fuel gauges for a second. One, I'll tell you, as a flight school owner, fuel cinders are very expensive. So as a fuel cinder goes bad from a tank, to get it fixed is a very expensive proposition, but one that's required, so they get fixed. But a fuel cinder is nothing more than a float and a device that then sends the information to a mechanical or electronic fuel gauge to give the pilot an indication of where that fuel tank is. Right. And if you fly much at all, you've probably seen one that's a little out of calibration, we'll call it, but they should be working. Some planes have a panel that might say low fuel or some other indication that you're having a fuel system problem. But a pretty important part of the fuel system all up is the fuel cinder and the fuel gauges. Yeah. And not one that I think many student pilots learn about. It's, we live in an iPad world, Wally, where it's either on or off or works or doesn't work. But it can give you some good information. If I want my 182 to be half full, but the gauges are showing 3/4, even if I dipstick that, I might want to think about this a little bit. Like, I could be way overweight here. Right. Might not get off the ground, so I should do some investigating. You might not trust them, but I would validate the information that they were sharing with me for sure. Yeah,
and one thing I would caution, be very cautious about, is airplanes that have engine analyzers. They're becoming more and more common. I've got them in both of my airplanes, and you have the ability to tell the engine monitor how much fuel is on board the airplane. So, I have JPIs in mine, and every time we start up, it asks if we fueled the airplane, and you either say yes or no. And if you say no, it assumes that it has the same amount of fuel in it that it thought it had when we put the airplane to bed the last time we flew it. And if we say yes, that we filled it up, it will ask you how much. Do you have full tanks? Did you just add 20 gallons? Whatever. Just know that unit is now taking the amount of fuel that you said was on board the airplane, and it's measuring the amount of fuel that's going to the engine, and it's giving you a number. Now, again, in my airplanes, the number is, we've got it dialed in to where it's I can almost tell to the tenth of a gallon how much fuel I'm going to need when I go top the airplane off. But the one thing that those engine analyzers will not know, they will not know about a fuel leak. So if we've got fuel leaking out of the left side, or say someone comes and has taken fuel out of the left side, or again, just a leak, it doesn't know that because it's not actually a fuel gauge. So you're looking at your engine analyzer. It's a nice digital display. It says you've got 17.6 gallons. And because it's so much easier to read, it's tempting to not pay attention to the fuel gauges that are over somewhere else on the panel, and they're hard to read. But they're actually accurate, and that 17.6 is not, because you may have had a fuel leak. Again, we don't see fuel leaks a whole lot, but it is something to definitely be thinking about.
Well, I've actually heard a few stories of fuel caps not being put back on.
Yeah.
You fly, and that's a fuel leak, but not one that's going to leave a residue when you come back on the ground and see that there's nothing dripping, but you might have lost a number of gallons,
right,
because that cap wasn't seated correctly or was gone all the way.
Right.
I guess the last thing that jumps to my mind, and if you have others, let's talk about them, but the Sumps. The Sumps are on every aircraft nowadays. I think that we fly at this flight school and other flight schools. We sump that fuel. There's the POH would tell you how many there are, but on an NP model, I believe there's one on each wing and one or two on the belly. We're sumping this for what reason, Wally? Why are we sumping the fuel tanks right there underneath the wings?
Well, basically, we're trying to see if there's water in the fuel or any contaminant in the fuel. I shouldn't just say water, but it could be any contaminant, anything other than in these airplanes we usually run 100 low lead, but anything but a blue tint to the fuel. If we don't, we've got some sort of a problem, and I would suggest that as a student pilot, if you've never seen what water in the fuel looks like, test it out. Go out there and get your little fuel tester, get a little bit of 100 low lead in there, and if you got a little water bottle with you, just pour some water in there so you can actually see what it looks like. It's very distinct. You can tell right away that something, it doesn't look like the other. The water is going to sink to the bottom. Water is heavier than 100 low lead, and you'll notice it right away.
No doubt. And it's an interesting thing where people should look at it and know what that's going to look like before maybe they accidentally run into it later on in the future.
And jet fuel is heavier than 100 low lead. So if by chance there happened to be jet fuel pumped in your airplane, you would see it right there, and you know most of the time in little Cessna 172s or Warriors, not going to be a big thing, but sometimes in bigger airplanes, the line personnel are confused. Is that a turboprop or not? Yeah,
I think that's the one that scares me, is the twin 4 tanks, and a fueler might just make a bad assumption, and that would be a very expensive bad assumption for sure.
Right.
So hopefully you've learned a whole lot about fuel systems today, both the Cessna of the flavor of Cessna and Piper. There's obviously a whole lot more to learn, but hopefully we shared a lot of insights with you to make you more aware of what's going on in your fuel system. Always reference back to that POH. And if you have questions, call and ask your CFI for more information. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.